Hey guys, welcome to PCA Distance Learning. This is World History, Chapter 27, World War I and its Aftermath. This is Section 3, Lesson 137, Winning the War. Hey, I realized in some of my earlier videos something very important was missing. You guys haven't seen my coffee cup for weeks, and I want you to know that it's right here with me, keeping me going. All right, so you can relax at home, never fear. All right, let's talk about winning the war in World War I as the war comes to a climax in 1918. Let's start with the idea of total war. There's an enormous economic impact from World War I, or at the time it was called the Great War because until we had World War II, nobody called it World War I. Both sides were making an enormous move away from the free market system. Both sides would develop systems to recruit and train and equip armies of millions of men. At the start of the war, recruiting stations were absolutely overwhelmed with the flood of volunteers. Many people literally could not get to a recruiting station door in the first couple days of the war. It was just so jammed. Well, that situation didn't last too long. As the casualty list mounted, recruiting levels fell while manpower needs continued to rise. And nations would then in turn develop various recruiting campaigns, many of which emphasize posters. I think the most famous one was British, and from that there were a number of takeoffs. British used the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, Lord Kitchener, and he's got this fabulous face filling up the poster and a big finger pointed, "Your country needs you." And there's an American takeoff, "Uncle Sam needs you," very much based on that British poster. The British, for quite a while, relied on volunteers. All other participants out of the original set moved to universal military conscription. That is, they drafted all the young men of a particular age group. And of course, as they took those folks in, they made exceptions for those with medical conditions. And generally speaking, most countries also kept certain critical occupations separate from the draft. So those that were involved in farming and weapons manufacture, you couldn't afford to do without the crops, you couldn't afford to do without the machine guns and the artillery tubes. So there wasn't much point in taking a guy out of a machine gun factory to have him operate a machine gun. The hundreds of machine guns that weren't getting made were probably more important than that one guy pulling a trigger. Germany went the furthest of all of the various nations. They were probably the most organized and integrated, and they forced civilian labor into certain occupations to make sure that wartime necessary services were completed. Now, in addition to labor, governments managed production. In most countries, strikes were illegal. Governments initially let out contracts to various businesses to make the required war material, and they realized over time that would be inefficient. Oftentimes, you would have the Army bidding against the Navy for uniforms, for example. And so the government would get more tightly organized and create committees to avoid competition, to avoid the government really fighting against itself. In the U.S., that was called the War Industries Board. And the government would take control of certain materials, steel, for example. And Bernard Baruch told the car manufacturers that he wanted them to make trucks for the war effort. And by and large, they initially refused. And he said, fine. But you don't have any steel, and you can't use railroads to move the cars you make out to your dealerships because I control both of those. And sure enough, a whole number of car dealers decided they were quite willing to make trucks for the Army if they could make a profit at it. Ladies' corsets ended. Corsets required steel. Well, there was enough steel in corsets to make a couple of warships. And services, the railroads in particular, were taken under government control so that the schedules were organized to move troops and equipment when the government needed them moved. States set up programs to reduce consumption. They rationed food. And they tried to do this in ways that gave people a choice. They could have, for example, surf and turf one day a month, or steak 4 times a month, or hamburger 20 times a month. Clothing, rubber were all recycled. They tried to reuse waste as much as possible. Fats that could be used to contribute to explosives. Governments in some cases mandated prices and wages, both to get more for what they were buying and also to avoid the worst effects of inflation. Now, a third part of government responsibility for the war involved paying for the war effort. And warring states traditionally used 2 primary methods. One of that was paying a portion of the cost out of current operating expenses. And that would come from taxes, and usually new taxes were raised on luxury goods and on war profits. The more money a business made, the higher level of taxes it would pay on that last dollar. And the second primary source of funding would be borrowing. Now, much of that was done domestically by selling bonds to citizens. I think on page 690, you see a poster for selling war bonds. And these are like the savings bonds of today. The citizen would provide a smaller amount of money up front, and the government would promise him repayment of a larger sum over time that would include a nice interest bonus as well. All right, total war involved economics. Total war also involved information. And nations sought to control public opinion to build support for the war effort. And that involved both information denial, we call that censorship, and information production, we call that propaganda. Obviously, a country at war wants to protect sensitive military information. When are ships due to sail between continents? When are troops supposed to move from point A to point B? You don't want the enemy finding that information out. Now, they would go further than that. They would restrict the publication of information that could be seen as discouraging. Casualty lists would not be published in their entirety after the very beginning of the war. Books and films that were seen to have an anti-war tone would be restricted. Now, in some ways, this connects to our world today. When we think about the COVID-19 crisis, you've probably heard of the Spanish flu. Well, the Spanish flu was so named not because Spain had a particularly robust level of problem with influenza, but because so many other European countries were restricting the spread of flu information because of concerns for its impact on the war. And so Spain was a country not involved. They were neutral, and they were much more open about what was happening than anyone else. So their announced casualty level appeared much higher than other countries, and that's where the name Spanish flu came from. All right, second aspect of information control is information production, or commonly propaganda. And my favorite definition of that, information with a purpose. And one of the simplest levels of propaganda was to say, in effect, we are the good guys, we wear the white hats. They are the bad guys, they wear the black hats. Excuse me for a second. Sorry. Let's take a look at the Ernst Lissauer quote on page 691. This comes from a poem entitled Hymn of Hate. It was directed initially against the British, who the Germans saw as their primary enemy. Hate by water and hate by land, hate by the head and hate of the hand. We love as one and we hate as one. We have one foe and one alone. England. Okay, so tell us how you really feel. Both sides saw themselves as the good guys, and of course their opponents then as the bad guys. The U.S. created an organization to manage public opinion, the Committee on Public Information, under the leadership of George Creel, who had worked on Woodrow Wilson's 1916 re-election campaign. And Creel would guide his committee to produce films and articles and speeches that would be released on a regular basis throughout the country. And one of the more common venues to do that would be at the movies. And he had a horde of speakers, 75,000 volunteers known as 4-Minute Men. And we're not talking about how fast they could run the mile. We're talking about the length of the speeches that they would read at the theaters. Normally, as you would watch the cartoons and the previews, you would throw in a pro-World War I speech. The British cut all of the German telegraph cables coming across the Atlantic to the United States. And that meant that they had a major advantage in the propaganda war for U.S. opinion. They could send whatever they wanted to the United States. Now, the best propaganda was the truth. Why? Well, certainly you can tell wildly embellished stories about the bad things the other guys are doing. The problem is, eventually the truth tends to win out. And a side that is renowned for exaggerating and telling untruth gets caught and loses credibility. Joseph Goebbels, Germany's propaganda minister in the Second World War, was particularly prone to gross exaggeration early, and it lost him a great deal of credibility later in the war. As an example, one German atrocity, one action that was deemed morally inappropriate and something that should have been easy to see in advance as the wrong thing to do. A British nurse, Edith Cavell. I think on 691 you see a short biography of Cavell. She was charged with harboring Allied prisoners and helping them to escape. Now, the fact is, she was guilty as charged. She had, in fact, aided about 60 British and about 15 French troops to escape from Belgium, where they've been getting medical care. And rather than them finishing up that course of medical care and being interned by the Germans, she helped them escape to the underground. And ultimately, the Germans would try her, convict her, and execute her. You know, this is just a bad idea. Shooting nurses. This is kind of like putting the Pope in jail. You know, maybe a couple of popes have done things that have deserved incarceration, but you're going to have a whole lot of folks in the world being very unhappy that you did that to the Pope in any case. I mean, God bless. You don't jail Santa Claus. You don't shoot nurses. So shooting Edith Cavell certainly hurt Germany far more than whatever they gained by sending the message that they were going to enforce their laws against letting prisoners escape. Okay, Edith Cavell serves as a little bridge here to the issue of what's the impact of the war on women. And as the war develops and more manpower is needed in the trenches and to fill increasing orders at the factories, there just aren't enough men to do all the jobs. And the obvious solution was women. So they were going to be given a broad range of opportunities in employment, and much of that involved fields that had historically seen none or very little participation from women previously. Women were certainly involved in traditional tasks. They would be nurses, they would be telephone switchboard operators and secretaries. Nursing could be well in the rear at modern and well-equipped hospitals, or it could be much closer to the front under much more primitive conditions. The role of women in war industries would be critical. Women would be involved in the manufacture and assembly of munitions. This is an area where women previously had no track record. Before 1900, you aren't going to see women making artillery shells, but by 1916, you certainly will. Now, this sort of begs the question, what's going to happen to this experiment of bringing women into new kinds of positions? The war's going to end. Most of the men will come home. They're going to want their jobs back. And you can see both sides of that equation. You have the new workers who want to hang on to their positions. You have the soldiers who want to come back and get their positions back. Neither side has done anything wrong, and you can understand both perspectives. By and large, after World War I, women are going to accept the notion that they should leave employment and return to their homes. Now, spoiler alert, that won't happen to the same degree in the Second World War. In many countries, and we could look at Britain, Germany, and the United States to name three, women will get the right to vote in the aftermath of the war, in large part as a reward for their valuable wartime services. All right, the war starts in August 1914. And by the time we get to 1917, 3 years into this puppy, morale is down. Nations are worn. Some nations are running out of manpower and raw materials and finances. The resources are getting thin. The longer the war went, the more efficient states were at combing out their resources and employing them for the war effort. And they watched their opponents sort of mirroring their actions. And both sides hoped that the next big push would bring about an end to the conflict. Well, by 1917, it's not looking like either side is going to get to break through. This is going to be a war of attrition. This is going to be a war kind of like the Civil War, where the South loses primarily because they ran out of healthy bodies to put in the trenches, and they're fighting 14-year-olds and 60-year-olds because they've got nobody in their 20s and 30s left to use. So casualties are increasing, there are supply and food shortages, and morale is declining pretty much across the board. The French army loses faith in its commanders and their wasteful expenditure of their soldiers' lives in some of these foolish attacks. And the army will mutiny in 1917. And they will announce to their command structure, hey, we'll hold the trenches, we'll defend. We won't let the Germans walk through the lines, but no more of this over-the-top stuff. We're not leaving the safety of our trenches. We're not going to attack machine guns behind barbed wire backed up with artillery. That's just a good way to die. And so we'll sit here and camp. And as long as you feed us, we'll guard the trenches, but that's it. The Italian army really has a collapse in morale at the Battle of Caporetto, which is also known as the 12th Battle of the Isonzo River. This is November of 1917, and the Italian army is going to lose over 300,000 effectives. 40,000 will be shot by the Austrians with German support. 265,000 will surrender as prisoners of war, believing that life in a prisoner of war camp is far safer than life in a trench. And when you look at those relative proportions, it's about 7-to-1. 7 soldiers are captured for 1 soldier who is wounded. That's the sign of an army that's just not willing to fight anymore. Okay, what happens in Russia? They are going to be hit the hardest of all the belligerent nations. And in World War I, we can come up with a couple of truisms. One is that a Russian soldier is probably better than an Austrian soldier. Well, conversely, a German soldier is better than a Russian soldier. The Germans had a much more modern military. That would include more machine guns, better rapid-firing artillery, things like radios. And when they had radios, the ability to use them in code so that the Russians couldn't simply get some German speakers and listen to all the German transmissions and know what was going on. So the Russians are really fighting uphill in a lot of ways. The Russian training program was very simplistic, and they relied on rolling out huge numbers of conscript infantry and launching frontal attacks with older style weapons. Well, this was a model for very high levels of casualties. The Russian figures of losses from World War I appear very unreliable. Numbers of 3 million dead and 4 million wounded seem very conservative compared to some of the other countries. And one thing that ought to be understood here, these 7 million guys shot, almost all of them were supporters of the Tsar. And it's going to mean the Romanov family has a lot less capital left in the game at the end of the war. The government's management of the war effort is inept. They can't keep up with railroad repairs to keep the transportation system running. And without transportation, they can't get food distribution to work to get some of the crops into the cities. There are going to be riots in Petersburg in March of 1917. And ultimately, at that point, Nicholas will abdicate the throne. He will step down. We are going to get a replacement known as the provisional government. That word provisional means temporary. And they understood themselves to be an interim solution. They believed that Russia required a constitution, that they were there to run things until they would organize a constitutional assembly and write a constitution and then hold an election, and then a real government would replace them down the line. Now, this provisional government is going to be far more democratic, based primarily out of individuals operating in the Duma or the Russian parliament. But they're going to make a huge error, and that is they're going to try to sustain the war effort. And that's going to open the door to the Russian Marxists or the Bolshevik faction under Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. And as Lenin will take power away from the provisionals in an armed insurrection late in 1917, he will sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. That's located right there between Poland and Ukraine. And this is really the end of Russian participation in the war. Now, what's that do to the military front line? The Germans have no further need to sustain hundreds of miles of front lines against the Russians. Their eastern front can close down, and it means they're free to concentrate their forces on the western front. And they understand that there are Americans on boats every day going over to France, and that they have a relatively limited window in which to win the war before the Americans can arrive and eventually add so much power to the Allies that the outcome will be inevitable. Okay, let's get the U.S. into this war. Remember again that under Woodrow Wilson, we had declared neutrality in August of 1914. Now, as time goes on, what we see is this neutrality is not even-handed. There is a very steady tilt in favor of the Allied powers against the Central powers. That's due to our history with Britain and France in the past. It's due to politics, our approval of the democratic nature of those countries' governments, and our disapproval of the German and Austrian and Russian autocracies. It's due to our trade. And again, the Allied powers had about a 5-to-1 advantage in trade relations with the U.S. over the Central powers in 1914. That's 3,000 times as much trade in 1916. Also, throw in most of the war news that came to the U.S. Through a British filter, slanted against a group the British would often call the Hun. Now, a big part of this is going to be unrestricted submarine warfare. Germany will declare a war zone in the waters around Britain and threaten to sink any ship that sailed inside that war zone as part of their blockade. The German U-boat 20 would see the passenger liner Lusitania in May of 1915 and hit it with a torpedo. 1,200 passengers and crew will die. About 10% of that number will be American. They couldn't lower the boats from the Lusitania. The second torpedo had put such a list to the boat so quickly that by the time they got people on the decks, it was totally unsafe to try to put the boats in the water. The Americans complained to Germany, and Germany would turn around and offer the Sussex Pledge. We won't do this anymore. And the issue is going to be shelved for about a year and a half. All right, the Germans want to win this war in 1917. They decide to resume unrestricted submarine warfare. They will announce in late January that this will take effect 1 February of 1917. They are going to try to go all out with submarine warfare, sink everything coming to Britain, and defeat the British by blockading them and cutting off their food supply. Now, not a horrible plan. They actually got Britain down to less than 7 weeks' food supply for the country. The problem is the Allies come up with an effective counter to German submarines. That's going to be the use of blockade. Blockade again being the use of convoy. And convoy will defeat the German blockade by grouping merchant ships into packages of 30, 40, 50, or even 60 at a time, and then surrounding that covey of transport ships with military vessels for defense against the submarines. Now, the Germans understood that the return to unrestricted submarine warfare was going to torque off the United States. And they came up with a plan to delay possible American entry into the war. They would invite Mexico to attack the United States. So the German Foreign Secretary is Arthur Zimmermann. Zimmermann sends a telegram to Mexico asking the German ambassador to Mexico to go to the Mexican president and propose to him that he attack the United States, and in return, Germany would help Mexico recover the lost provinces of Arizona and New Mexico and Texas way back from the Mexican-American War and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. Now, the British intercept this Zimmerman telegram. They decode it, and they give it to the United States in February. And Germany, probably rather foolishly, publicly confirmed that the British claims were in fact correct. And the U.S. would then declare war on Germany. In April of 1917, the U.S. would raise and train a military of just under 5 million men by the end of the war. And they will begin to send a package to France, the American Expeditionary Force, the AEF, under General John J. Blackjack Pershing. And that force will come very close to 2 million men by the end of the war, and it certainly would have continued to rise if the war had gone on any longer. Woodrow Wilson released his 14-point peace plan in January of 1918. Two big ideas. Number one, an organization for world peace, which he labels the League of Nations. It's the forerunner to the United Nations that we have today. And secondly, a concept that he will use in various applications, and his concept is self-determination. Who should determine the future of Poland? Not the Germans, not the Russians, but the people of Poland. The people of Belgium should determine the future of Belgium. The people of Russia should determine the future of Russia. Now, at the time, both the Allied powers and the Central powers rapidly reject the 14 points. Okay, let's look at the final military campaign of 1918. The Germans launch their spring offensive, sometimes called the Kaiserschlacht, or sometimes the Ludendorff offensive. General Ludendorff, as the military advisor to General Hindenburg, is coming up with the specific plans to make this offensive happen. And in a war where gains have been measured in dozens of yards, the Germans are going to gain in a month about 40 miles at various places in the front. And there is much more mobility in 1918 than we've seen since the fall of 1914. The American forces are pushed up to the front, and they will engage in a defense of Paris, both at Chateau Thierry and at Belleau Wood. And when these attacks are stopped, the German chance for a military victory is pretty much gone. The Allies will take the offensive in the summer of 1918 with the so-called 100 Days attack. And in a lot of ways, it begins at the Battle of Amiens, 8 August 1918. A major artillery strike followed by hundreds of tanks, 400 plus tanks employed in one place. And General Ludendorff will call this the Black Day of the German army. You have entire units who are quitting. They're not getting fed regularly. They don't have sufficient ammunition. Supplies are wearing out. They're not getting reinforcements. And the German army morale begins to crack at this point in the war. Allied offensives continue in multiple locations, making consistent gains across the front. One of the very last offensives in the war will be conducted by the United States Army as it drives into the Argonne Forest in September of 1918 and approaches the French border city of Sedan. You have really an enormous shift in morale. The Germans had been storming forward in the spring, and now the Allies sense that victory is at hand. The increasing power of American aid makes it clear that however long the war is going to last, momentum is probably in the Allied camp, and the Germans now think the war is unwinnable. They are personally exhausted, and most of their cohorts in the Central Powers have individually given up the war effort. So the last steps here are generally diplomatic. Hindenburg and Ludendorff, as the supreme military commanders, will meet with Kaiser Wilhelm II in September of 1918 and tell him the war cannot be won or even drawn. It's time for a diplomatic solution to bail out the German army because the German army can't hold on. Germany contacts the United States because the 14 points from Wilson seems much nicer than anything they've heard from the Brits or the French. Now, Wilson's going to demand regime change. He's going to demand that Hindenburg and Ludendorff step down, that a new government come in, and that the Kaiser should abdicate the throne. And the Germans are going to decide to do those things to get some sort of diplomatic solution. And they bring in a new chancellor. Prince Max from Baden will take charge of the government. In hindsight, I think that was a major error. Whoever ends up signing a deal with the Allies is going to have egg on his face domestically within Germany. He's going to look bad to be signing a surrender document. And it would have been far better to put that stigma on the army and the Kaiser to make clear that they were the losers. And instead, by getting a different government, those folks are going to get stuck with the responsibility for accepting a rather disastrous peace. And the military is going to resurrect itself a few years later with this stab in the back myth. All right, as the Americans sign a deal with the Germans, the Allies speak up and say, by the way, we don't accept the 14 points. Those aren't reasonable to us. For example, you talk about a reduction of armaments. Well, that's great for the Germans, but we, the French, need to hang on to our army, and we, the British, need to hang on to our navy. And so we're going to see a mission led by Colonel Edward House, a trusted ally of Wilson, go to Paris and come up with some revisions of the 14 points, some mutual understandings within the Allied powers. Wilson doesn't tell the public about these revisions. He doesn't tell the Germans. So he's going to go to Paris with the Germans having believed they've been given one deal and the Allies believing that they've been given a different deal. That perhaps was not perfect wisdom. All right, the generals will meet in a train car in a clearing in the forest in Compiègne in France on the morning of the 11th of November. At about 6 o'clock, they would sign a document that would take effect about 5 hours later. The armistice took effect on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. It certainly was one of the more expensive minutes in world history because millions of soldiers decided they wanted to fire the last shot in World War I, and everybody knew the moment the gun would go up. So at 10:59:55, everybody is locking and loading whatever they've got to pull a trigger on, and the war goes out in this gigantic spasm of violence and explosives. The Germans will give up much of their weaponry, their tanks, their artillery, their aircraft, their navy. They will return to the Allies the prisoners they've taken, and all sides will agree to meet in Paris a few weeks later. January 1919, they will gather for the process of turning an armistice into a treaty. Hey guys, go forth, do great and wonderful things, enjoy the sunshine today. God bless.